The opening shot of the second episode of House of the Dragon's second season establishes that we'll be looking at how the death of King Aegon II's heir Jaehaerys will affect both sides of the conflict. In the book Fire and Blood, this chapter opens by saying, "The Dance of the Dragons entered a new stage after the death of Lucerys Velaryon in the Stormlands and the murder of Prince Jaehaerys before his mother's eyes in the Red Keep. For both the Blacks and the Greens, blood called to blood for vengeance. And all across the realm, lords called their banners, and armies gathered and began to march." As a historical account, the book examines the aftermath of the young prince's death from the big picture perspective and how it affects the realm. The show can zoom in to explore how it affects the characters as individuals and as members of their respective factions, and that's what the episode does for most of its runtime. This doesn't make for the most exhilarating watch. There's a bit of a drop-off in excitement from the premiere, but it's easy to see how some of the minor changes the show introduced make these situations more complicated and thus more interesting to think about. If you watched my last video, I brought up that the blood and cheese scene was handled a little differently in the show. A big change for the Greens is that Helaena hasn't had her son Maelor yet. That meant that she didn't have to choose between her sons as she did in the book, and in getting caught up in that change and how it affected things for her, it didn't occur to me that it also meant that Aegon lost his only male heir. This is interesting because as we see in the episode, his legacy is now in question. And because he can't name his daughter as his heir, based on the fact that some of the lords wouldn't accept her, as they didn't accept Rhaenyra, is where his claims of legitimacy come from. Now he's in a situation that's very similar to the one his father, King Viserys, was in. If he doesn't name his daughter Jaehaera, which he won't, he has to name his younger brother Aemon as his successor, or produce another male heir. Granted, he doesn't have the same reservations about One Eye that Viserys did about the Rogue Prince, which makes his choice a little easier. But it's also fun that the way Daemon experienced being passed over comes up on the other end, which is something we'll definitely come back to. Aegon declares war on a very visible part of his father's legacy, his scale model of old Valyria he spent so much of his time working on, or I guess having other people work on so that he could sit around and marvel at it. It's kind of wild that we saw him show more interest in this than he ever did in his son, who is now king and has to live with it in his quarters. Perhaps this outburst of pure rage from a father whose child was just taken from him in an unfathomable act of depravity will have the unintended consequence of helping Aegon move on from that. Just get this thing out of his space, because if we know that Viserys favored it over his firstborn son, then the son in question definitely knows that. Mentally, the king is in the same space Rhaenyra was in the last episode. Son is dead, and because the parent believes they know who is responsible, they want vengeance. As for the Blacks, another change is that their plan was simply a son for a son in the book. Daemon had already left for Harrenhal. He sent word to Mysaria, who was still in King's Landing. She handled the details, and perhaps because it would have been easier than going after Aemon, you just got the sense that the Blacks were okay with going after a couple of innocents after what happened to Luke. Hopefully I won't have to do this in every video, but I will bring up the fact again that Fire and Blood is a historical text based on a collection of after-the-fact accounts that were then filtered through the perspective of the Archmaester who compiled them. That last part is the key here, because many people have argued that the show has made Rhaenyra a lot more likable than she is in the book, and see this as a bias toward her side. I'd agree that at least the first part of that is true, but then I'd also point out that being written by a maester means the book should be slightly biased towards the Greens. I wouldn't say it's as cut and dry as some fans of the Blacks might make it out to be. If you read the book, they aren't exactly giving the Greens a pass on everything, just because the Hightowers have a lot of influence in Old Town where the Citadel is located. But it certainly makes sense that they might choose to paint the Blacks' actions in a less favorable light. So the show making it explicit that Rhaenyra sought her vengeance specifically through Aemond, and then less explicitly saying that Daemon passed that on, but also specified that he would be fine with the young heir's head if that didn't work out, really changes the internal relations between the Black Queen and the King Consort on that side. I say less explicitly because the show chose to cut away rather than show us Daemon's answer when they asked what they should do if they couldn't find Aemond. But I'm in the camp that absolutely believes that he told them to kill the kid in that case. It just makes sense if you dehumanize the victim and look at it strategically, and I already brought up how it undermines Aegon's legacy, which is something that Daemon would see a value in doing. That would be enough, but it's also coming from the guy who killed his first wife, who could have also been considered an innocent because she was in the way of him getting what he wanted. I was a little surprised that Rhaenyra took the same position and that it happened so fast. She does a good job of laying her thought process out in their conversation, though. It made sense for her to be upset because the child was an innocent, and his death undermined her position. We see that play out with her council, who are right there in front of her. I can only imagine what people will be saying behind her back, since it negates the PR gift that they'd received through Aemon's heinous act of kinslaying. It doesn't help that in King's Landing, Otto acts shrewdly to capitalize on the potential shift in perception, and puts things together to have Jaehaerys' body paraded through the streets with Queen Helaena and her mother Alicent following behind in a wagon so that their grief can be on full display. This is not an easy sell, but after he tells Aegon that he'll eventually get his war, but that honoring his son as a Targaryen prince in public will do more for them now than 1,000 knights in battle, and when he tells the Queen Dowager that the realm must see the sorrow of the crown, best expressed through its most gentle souls, they have to admit that there is an opportunity to take advantage of here. Alicent gets a grieving Helaena on board, and in the brief scene they share before the procession, we start to get a closer look at how the Queen is experiencing her loss. Because Helaena has mostly been ignored by the rest of her family, you start to realize how much the unconditional love she gets from her children would matter to her. Of course, any mother would be devastated by her situation, but after just a few scenes, I think we have a much better understanding of the character. It's gutting to see her holding on to what will eventually become the funeral shroud for her boy, which she was working on when Aegon came looking for him before the small council meeting in the premiere, and then to see it wrapped around his tiny body as they follow him through the streets. It's an uncomfortable situation for all involved, and gets especially difficult for Helaena when they get stuck briefly and the crowd closes in on them. This scene also serves to give us a good look at the updated heraldry associated with Aegon's reign. Instead of the red dragon on black, he chose a gold dragon that represents the golden scales of his dragon Sunfire, and the Hightower green from his mother's family. We also hear them announcing Rhaenyra's crimes, and see that it appears to be turning the small folk against her. When presented with the news in front of the Black Council, Rhaenyra is initially surprised that people would think she was capable of doing something like that, though she eventually puts it together that she did just send Daemon to King's Landing to assassinate Aemond. This leads to the tense conversation in her chambers I touched on, where she comes to the conclusion that she can't trust him. For viewers, the idea that he's only concerned with his personal glory isn't a major revelation. It's not the same for her because she's in the middle of it, and there are romantic notions surrounding their bond that people cling to because it's pretty hot, right? But based solely on the things we've seen him do, it would be hard to argue against any of what she puts forward here. They sort of reach a different level when she asks if he accepts her as his queen and ruler, which he never answers directly because the talk turns to his brother naming Rhaenyra his heir, and Daemon's belief that Viserys only used his daughter as a tool to put him in his place. So while it's a bit of a surprise to see this rift develop so early in the conflict, by the end of their conversation you can see that it's real and will influence their decisions going forward. Daemon ignores his daughter Bella on the way out to add insult to injury, and then we see that Rhaenyra had summoned Bella because she wanted to send her and her dragon Moondancer to keep an eye on King's Landing after she wouldn't let Jace go and do the same thing. We do see Daemon leave Dragonstone on Caraxes in an impressive looking scene, which I think is a big step up from most of the dragon sequences from the first season. It gets me pumped up to see more of them in the weeks ahead. The other major change around Blood and Cheese that led to ripple effects in this episode was that Alicent and Criston were in bed together when everything went down. Criston's answer that he was abed when Aegon asked where he was kind of funny. Sort of like, yeah bro, a bed. But this development is something I came out in favor of right away because I just thought it made sense. Then I listened to Olivia Cooke talking about it on the official podcast and liked it even more. She pointed out how this is almost like Alicent experiencing those teenage years she missed out on, given that she started having Viserys' children whenever she was 14. And I just kept thinking about her doing her duty in those scenes where Viserys would come to her room at night. The thing with her sworn protector is something they put off until he died. And yeah, there are the Kingsguard vows and the obvious hypocrisy of how they made such a big deal out of Rhaenyra's transgressions. But given how things played out, that also makes sense for a person that found herself in her situation. Plus, she might have been shitty about it, but it doesn't mean that Rhaenyra having bastards so openly wasn't an issue. Cole is less sympathetic since he's still carrying around a grudge for what happened all those years ago and is now essentially taking the role of the royal whore that he was so offended by when Rhaenyra suggested it. Regardless of where you come down on it, it's become a major source of guilt and shame after Blood and Cheese. It comes up several times in the episode. In the opening moments when she's alone with Otto, it's apparent that Alicent blames herself and wonders out loud if the gods are punishing her. Otto asks for what sin here, and then later she almost comes clean, but by that point, things have really taken a turn, so he says he doesn't wish to hear of it. There's another scene where he's at his post outside her room, and Alicent asks Criston if he's told anyone. And when he responds, "What do you take me for?" she says, "One who seeks absolution." And to that, he comes clean that he doesn't believe that would be possible for what he's done. He channels that guilt into throwing his weight around and berating Sir Auric about his soiled white cloak, which I guess there's some symbolism there if you're looking for it. It gets a little ridiculous as he starts to question him about why he couldn't be everywhere at once and stop what happened. Auric poses some good questions, like where was Cole when it happened, and why hasn't Helaena been assigned a sworn protector since she is the queen now? And Cole turns that around to accuse him of being involved since his brother sided with Rhaenyra. This leads to Criston sending him on an assassination mission alone to impersonate his brother so that he can infiltrate Dragonstone and kill Rhaenyra inside her own walls. This is my least favorite part of the episode because it feels a little like a side story in an installment that otherwise kept me engaged while it navigated the complicated aftermath of the young prince's death, bouncing back and forth from one side to the other in what almost felt like real time. And maybe it's just because it's Criston who kinda sucks. There's very little to like about the character at this point, and because of his generally grating personality and pettiness, it means that he's not even terribly entertaining like a heel can be. So they're gonna need to do more if they want me to care what he's up to. But a lot is going down in this supersized episode that does give them the extra space to string together a series of small moments that are all worth a mention. Cole even gets one to humanize him some when he has to look away when he sees Jaehaerys' bloody bedding. There's a really sad moment when Aegon passes his wife on the stairs and just sort of looks at Helaena like he has no idea how to talk to her before he walks away without saying anything. Seeing her nod her head like, yeah, this is my life, is a blink and you might miss it moment, and the kind of detail I love to see them include. His brother Aemond has a couple of scenes where he doesn't interact with his family at all. We see him in his quarters where he realizes that he was Blood and Cheese's real target, and then later at the pleasure house with the madam he spoke to when he was searching for Aegon ahead of his coronation. Aemond said his brother took him there on his 13th birthday to lose his virginity, and it appears he developed a regular thing with the madam after being reacquainted at the end of last season. That he's isolated from his family in this episode and spends his time in the brothel curled up on this much older woman's lap feels like something the show wants us to take note of. This scene also highlights how little we know about Aemon and tries to fill in the blanks. He's kind of pumped that Daemon sees him as a threat and is afraid of him on some level. Riding Vhagar will do that for you. He also mentions that he does feel bad about what happened to Luke and losing his temper that day. She uses this to point out that when princes lose their temper, other people usually pay the price, which is something that I love to see in there. Or maybe loved is the right word, I guess, because then she adds the small folk like me to the end of it which seemed totally unnecessary. And I wouldn't say this show is one of the biggest offenders, so maybe this rant is a little bit more about a trend to spell things out for the audience in the current TV landscape. But this is such a great example because she even pauses for a beat so you can piece together what she's saying. And you're like, ah, yes, the small folk. So when she says it, it's like there's an echo in your head. And instead of that feeling that you get for being rewarded for paying attention to what's happening. But this also leads to another small folk check-in, where we see Hugh, the smithy who petitioned the king in episode 1, at home with his wife, where we learn that they have a sick daughter. This shows us how the blockade is starting to make things difficult for regular people in King's Landing, and that if it continues, the little bit of goodwill the Greens earned from the tragedy surrounding the little prince's death might not be enough to keep the masses in check. Speaking of little princes, there's a quiet moment where we see Rhaenyra spending some time watching her sons Aegon and Viserys play. We have to imagine that as a mother, this would evoke thoughts of Jaehaerys and what Helaena is feeling right now. And speaking of the small folk, she also has a conversation with Mysaria, who is disappointed to find out that Daemon skipped town without making good on his promise to set her free. When she's brought in there, there's one of those shots that always jump out in a show like this and get you a little bit excited, where you can see the page in the book she's reading. In this case, it's about Aegon the Conqueror. It mentions his inability to conquer Dorne in the conquest and the start of the First Dornish War. It also mentions him proving himself as a highly skilled dragon rider at the end of the Century of Blood, which was a time of chaos and destruction that preceded him setting his sights on Westeros. When pressed about why she's there, Mysaria explains that she gave Daemon 2 names in King's Landing and didn't even want to do that much. After some back and forth, Rhaenyra remembers who she is based on the stolen dragon egg encounter from last season. And at first she doesn't want to honor Daemon's promise to set her free because she realizes she could be an asset or might find some incentive to betray her if she was out in the world. Mysaria tells her the story of arriving in Westeros with nothing, fighting her way up and eventually earning her place and a home, only to have it all burned down by who she presumed was Otto after she revealed herself to him to negotiate the shutdown of the child fighting pits before she gave up where Aegon was hiding. We saw that this was actually done by Larys on Alicent's behalf, but either way, her story strikes a chord with the Queen. A little later, she visits her in her cell and sets her free, and books her passage on a Valyrian ship on its way to the Free Cities. Elsewhere on Dragonstone, we get a scene between Jace and his betrothed, Baela. This is the kind of scene that might trigger your TV viewing senses, since we're seeing a side of them we've never seen before, and really getting our first introduction to Baela, which can sometimes foreshadow that something bad is about to happen to one of these characters. That's not the only reason to include a scene like this, because it's also mentioned that Baela's a dragon rider, which becomes more important now that Daemon's gone. But I liked how they played this, considering Jace was quick to volunteer to take to the skies and patrol King's Landing, and Rhaenyra was quick to stop him, only to make the choice to have Baela do it instead. Either way, it's a nice moment where there's some intimacy as they talk about their fathers, with an explicit mention of Harwin, which is nice for Jace, who's been forced to live a lie for his entire life through no fault of his own. Having his future wife accept his situation without judgment is no small thing, because you can imagine the internal turmoil he's experienced, having everyone know he's a bastard while also having to maintain the lie at all costs. It's a heavy thing for a kid. You also feel for her since her father barely pays any attention to her at all. We get a quick check-in with the Queen Who Never Was and the Sea Snake. He's concerned that Daemon has left Dragonstone when they needed him, and she points out that he was never very good at taking orders from anyone. He asks if she thinks he would challenge Rhaenyra, which she doesn't, not as such anyway, and then they agree that if he's able to take Harrenhal, all might be forgiven. Harrenhal also came up in Jace and Baela's conversation because taking the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms is something Daemon had planned to do. You'll probably remember that it was partially destroyed by Aegon during the conquest, since the effects of that were still visible when the show opened there with the Great Council of 101 choosing King Jaehaerys' heir in the premiere. Beyond its size, if you look at it on a map, its central location has obvious advantages. And since it's situated in the Riverlands, it has access to a lot of fertile land that could come in handy when you have armies to feed. You also remember its previous Lord Lionel Strong and his son Harwin are now dead thanks to Larys. so there are lots of reasons for him to go there, and a lot of advantages in taking it for their cause. The big question is whether he'll come around to accept Rhaenyra as his queen and ruler. Their argument revealed just how twisted up he got himself over being the second son, which wasn't new information, but does serve as a reminder of the considerations involved for Rhaenyra just to have him at her side. But I should add that all of this is a little beside the point because he also rides Caraxes, which makes him essential to any sort of victory for the Blacks. So Corlys and Rhaenys' notion that if he takes Harrenhal all might be forgiven is a pretty sober take. They're not the only people we spend time with on Driftmark. In the premiere, we had a brief introduction to Alan of Hall, and in this episode, we meet his brother Adam. I kinda let out a little sigh of relief when Adam indicated to his brother that the sea snake owed him, and then added to that to say that he owed them. It feels like a clear indication that they believe that there's a possibility that Corlys is their father, which would explain some of their weirdness in the scene he shared with Alan in the premiere. Adam thinks it's great that his brother is getting to serve with the sea snake, but Alan has reservations because he knows real war is coming. His brother thinks this sounds like an opportunity, and then later we see him catching crabs on the shore as the dragon sea smoke flies by. This is a not so subtle reminder that there are still unclaimed dragons out in the world, which if you put 2 and 2 together means there's opportunity in claiming one when the realm is on the brink of an all-out dragon war. There's still a steep barrier to entry since it's presumed you have to have the right blood to claim them. But Seasmoke was Corlys' son Laenor's mount, which we see him fly against the Crab Feeder's forces way back in episode 3 of the series. He left him behind when he faked his death, which makes this a little more complicated. Dragons often take new riders when their previous one dies. We saw Aemon claim Vhagar during her last rider Laena's funeral, so that's not out of the ordinary. But there's no mention in history of a dragon taking a new rider when their old one is still alive. The bond appears to last until death, and Laenor isn't dead yet, at least not as far as we know. Of course, Laenor and Laena also had Rhaenys' blood, so it's not necessarily a given that any offspring he has outside of his marriage would also be able to claim dragons. So we might be getting a little ahead of things there, but it does seem that they're setting the brothers from Hall up to play an active role this season. So what a difference a day makes for King Aegon II, the magnanimous defender of the small folk. I mean, to be fair, he did lose his son and heir, whose stitched up head had me terrified that it was going to roll into the street during the funeral procession. So I feel like I have a connection to some of his pain. Larys provides him with an opportunity for vengeance when he offers up Blood, who was captured trying to leave the city with Jaehaerys' head in a sack. He comes clean in the interrogation leading up to Aegon ending him by giving up that his partner was a royal rat catcher, but that he never knew his true name. Aegon makes a decisive move, hanging all the royal rat catchers and displaying their bodies in the streets. We see that he does get his man, since Cheese is among the dead bodies, but he almost seems surprised about how this would undermine the advantage they secured in public opinion after his son's murder. Otto comes in to lay that out for him, and the way this has so many similarities with Rhaenyra and Daemon's argument was pretty satisfying. Especially when you think about the fact that Daemon and Otto have been going after each other since the beginning. Each one was motivated by the fact that they were sure that the other would tank the realm during Viserys' reign because they were too concerned with serving their self-interest. From there, you start to notice some of the other echoes. Things like Daemon's argument with his brother in the throne room, the last time he skipped out of town on his dragon, and on the other side, the conversation between Otto and Viserys the first time he got fired from his job as Hand. When I first watched this episode, I was a little surprised to see how quickly they were both sidelined in their respective factions, and that both men were exiled by the episode's end. They're just so central to the whole conflict. But after thinking about it a bit, Daemon and Rhaenyra's argument is more of a continuation of the one in the finale where he choked her after learning Viserys never told him about Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy. They sort of came back together at the end of that through the news about Luke, and then she left Dragonstone for a few days, so it makes sense that that's still where her head is at, and his sort of non-reaction over Jaehaerys' death doesn't help his case. Otto's turn into berating his grandson seemed especially short-sighted and a little unhinged, but it might reflect an understanding that he can't control the new king, who's now dead set on vengeance. Plus, there's the reality that his way wasn't working. They did touch on that several times over the last 2 episodes, and that's why he saw opportunity in the tragedy in the first place, so going for broke might have seemed like his only option. It doesn't work. As I mentioned, he loses his place just like Daemon did, and he initially thinks about going to Old Town, where he finally mentions Alicent and Viserys' other son, Daeron, who's also a dragon rider, by the way, so it's always been kind of weird that they never mentioned him to this point. But the Dowager sends him to Highgarden instead, because the Tyrell's bannermen are wavering. As much as a loss as this episode feels all the way around for Otto, Alicent still thinks this is mostly about Jaehaerys and that she'll be able to rein her son in after tempers cool down. Her father pointed out the disparity in their views and the ones of the younger generation, who do happen to be the ones who are actually in charge. And I think it's a valid point to make. Aegon wants to spill blood, and he named Cole as his hand because he thinks he'll indulge him. But even knowing all that, Otto still thinks they'll prevail in the long game. The last big thing that happened felt a little anticlimactic for me, but I'm guessing I might be in the minority on that, and regardless, what they were going for is still apparent. What I thought worked best about this episode was the tight focus on the aftermath of this harrowing child murder, on the individuals at the center of that, on both sides of the conflict. The way that brings up all this unresolved stuff from Viserys' time as king, and how trust is coming into question in the scramble for power in the wake of his death. In a way, this ill-conceived prank, as Otto refers to it, this plan for Auric to impersonate his brother to get close to Rhaenyra, is an illustration of that. 2 brothers who came down on opposite sides of the conflict have their familial bond torn apart as a result. But the way this plays out, the real tragedy is that Criston sets this all in motion because he can't deal with his own shame of being in bed with Alicent when the prince was killed. This makes Auric more sympathetic since he's duty-bound to go through what he knows to essentially be a suicide mission. Even if he was successful in killing Rhaenyra, there wouldn't be much chance of his escaping the castle after that happened. They built a pretty solid set piece on top of that. The disorientation was real. I had no idea which one was which when things got going, and they sold the fact that these were 2 people engaged in a fight for their lives where the goal was more about not losing than winning. Of course, no one can win in the end, which is a fine point to make with war as a backdrop. And Eric, with an E, Rhaenyra's sworn shield, bests his brother, but can't live with what he's done, so he asks the queen to forgive him, which also feels like a plea to his fallen brother. Then he falls on his own sword. I should add that Mysaria saw Auric, with an A, arriving from King's Landing on her way to the ship after she just left the castle where she had seen Eric. It happens off screen, but the implication is that she returns to tell the guards inside what's happening, which amounts to her choosing Rhaenyra's side over her freedom. She had her chance to leave without any complications, and she decided to go back. This probably makes sense because Rhaenyra hasn't appeared to be very close with the members of her council. So with Daemon away, she could probably use some close allies she can count on. The episode actually ends in King's Landing, though. I already touched on Alicent and Otto's farewell conversation before his trip to Highgarden, and when she tried to confess her affair and his not wanting to hear about it. I took that to mean that he already knows and doesn't take issue with it, at least not in the middle of everything else that's happening. I haven't talked to anyone else that's seen it though, so I'll be curious to hear what people think. I thought they parted on pretty solid terms in comparison to how things were left on Dragonstone. The closing shots reveal that regardless of his bravado, King Aegon is affected by what's happening. He may not be a good person, but he's not quite a sociopath either. I'm sure it's a bit of everything, including the loss of his son, but I got the sense that Otto's response to him saying his father chose him to be king is what got him to the point of sobbing in his final scene. I took Otto's laughing and saying, "Is that what you think?" as him doing some of the peacocking he attributed to the younger generation. I mean, at the very least, it seemed like he never believed that Viserys told Alicent he wanted Aegon to be king. That was just a convenient thing that happened as he was already planning on making him king either way. So the laugh and the "is that what you think" is just him saying, I'm the one who put you on the throne and you need me to hold it all together. While he won't be there to pull the strings, the episode ends with another sexual encounter between Alicent and now Hand of the King Criston Cole, which shows that they'll still be able to exert their influence behind the scenes. And I think that is a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.